Welcome to another deep dive.
Yes, welcome everyone.
You know how this works.
We take a big stack of sources.
Extract the key insights just for you.
And today
we are diving deep into Peter Drucker's The Age of Discontinuity,
the classic book,
written back in 1968.
with a preface in 1978.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
We are talking predictions from
Over.
half a century ago.
Yeah, so.
And see what they tell us about today.
Trying to understand today.
And our mission with this is to give you a framework
Not just a history lesson.
for understanding the big shifts happening right now.
That's right.
So for you, the listener out there,
Whether you're deep in this
already,
already.
yeah, or you're just incredibly curious,
Ah.
we're going to unpack these complex
In
ideas.
plain language,
Just,
get ready for some surprising connections
yeah,
and satisfying aha moments.
as we explore the forces that shape the world then.
And continue to shape yours today.
We've got material spanning economics, technology,
Cultural change.
even the very nature of knowledge itself.
Big stuff.
Yeah.
Mm.
One of the first fascinating shifts that Drucker highlighted was
Oh, yeah.
the end of what he calls the Great Migration
Right.
in developed countries around
The early 1970s.
the early 1970s.
It's interesting when you think about it,
Yeah.
how clearly Drucker saw
Yeah.
the exhaustion of those underemployed agricultural populations,
Right.
which had been a major engine for growth.
After World War II.
He uses Japan as a prime example.
Okay.
Back in 1946, nearly 60% of the population worked on farms.
Okay.
By the time he was writing that preface,
Late 70s.
in the late 70s, that had plummeted to just 8%.
Wow.
And that workforce was largely older women.
So interesting to see that shift.
Yeah.
And it was a similar story playing out in the U.S. with the end of the sharecropper era.
Mechanization.
Yeah.
Tractors meant fewer and fewer opportunities.
Up in those rural communities.
Plus, Western and Northern Europe had reached a point where they couldn't absorb more underemployed laborers.
From the Mediterranean countries?
They were hitting social and cultural limits.
Yeah. And so the big takeaway here
For you.
is understanding that relying on large-scale demographic shifts
Right.
for those easy productivity gains
For easy growth.
is a thing of the past.
Yeah.
We've got to look at other livers now.
Exactly. This is a fundamental structural change
Yes.
in how labor works in developed nations.
Yeah, and so to understand these kinds of shifts, Drucker uses
Oh, yeah. You use
a really insightful metaphor.
Oh, absolutely.
He describes his book, The Age of Discontinuity, as a handcar going ahead of the freight train
A freight train.
of massive trends. You're
Right.
looking out for explosives
That is unexpected events
that can derail everything.
Right. So what kind of explosives was he looking out for?
Well, he stresses the importance of discontinuities,
Yeah.
not just gradual change, but qualitative structural shifts.
In how we perceive things, what things mean to us, our core values.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he argues these kinds of shifts are much more powerful in shaping the future than these seemingly invincible trends that you might track on a spreadsheet.
He gives this powerful example of the national mood in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
In 1959, it was all about affluence and prosperity.
Right.
And then just 10 years later, in 1969, the conversation had changed.
To poverty.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he argues that you couldn't have predicted that dramatic shift just by looking at economic statistics.
It was a change in what people cared about.
It was the national psyche.
The national psyche, absolutely.
So we have to pay attention to data,
Of course, of course.
but also be aware of these more subtle underlying shifts in our collective values and how we see the world.
Because those are the things
Yeah,
that bring about the most profound changes.
absolutely. And he then draws a really interesting comparison between periods of stability and turbulence.
Uh-huh.
And he does this by looking at the 50 years before he wrote the book
Okay.
and contrasting it with the 50 years before World War I.
Okay. Interesting.
And the really fascinating thing is he points out that the half-century leading up to his writing was actually a period of relative stability when it came to major technological and industrial disruptions.
Okay.
And then he contrasts that with the 50 years before World War I.
Yeah.
And that was a explosion of invention.
Total opposite.
Total opposite.
Yeah.
And he reels off this incredible list. Synthetic dyes, Bessemer steel process, the electric generator, the light bulb, the phonograph, the typewriter, the telephone, the automobile, aluminum, vulcanized rubber, wireless communication, aspirin, the airplane, the electronic tube.
I mean, it's almost hard to imagine that much fundamental innovation packed into such a short period.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is the societal impact of these inventions.
Okay.
Take the typewriter, the telephone.
Yeah.
Changed the nature of office work.
Yeah.
Opened up huge opportunities for women.
Absolutely.
And that had a knock-on effect for female emancipation.
Right. And
suffrage.
automobile, beyond just getting around, became a symbol of mobility and freedom.
Oh, yeah.
And he makes this point that the entire consumption-driven economies of the advanced countries, their incredible productivity, their technological dominance, all of that was built on those foundational inventions from the Victorian and Edwardian eras.
Right.
And that the decades leading up to his writing were essentially just those advanced countries fulfilling the promises of those earlier breakthroughs.
Right.
And so that leads him to his central thesis. And what's so important for us to understand is that that stability was coming to an end.
Right.
And we were entering what he called an age of discontinuity.
In the world economy and technology?
Yeah. Significant and unpredictable changes were coming across a wide range of fields.
Yeah, and that's really...
And so let's talk about productivity.
Sure.
Drucker explains that those impressive rates of productivity growth after World War II.
The 3% in the U.S., the 6-7% in Japan, largely driven by moving workers out of those lower productivity farm jobs into more productive sectors.
Like manufacturing and services.
Yeah, that boom in agricultural technology meant that a smaller number of farmers, increasingly skilled farmers,
Right.
could produce huge quantities of food,
Yeah.
which freed up all those people to move into other sectors.
Right. And that drove the post-war economic boom that everyone's heard about.
Right.
And he draws a contrast with the Soviet Union.
Okay.
They had a huge number of underemployed people in rural areas,
Okay.
but kept on collective farms.
Right. And this actually...
This hampered agricultural productivity.
It did.
And also slowed the growth of urban service industries.
Which limited their consumer growth.
Yeah, because resources were being poured into new industrial development.
Right.
So the big takeaway there is that the major engine for growth in many developed nations was this big shift in where people worked.
Yeah, and as we said earlier, that was coming to an end.
That engine was starting to sputter out
Right.
around the time that he was writing.
Right.
Another insight he makes is the importance of what he calls steel consumers.
Steel consumers.
He explains that U.S. steel, the industry, saw huge growth after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And that was partly because its production capacity was largely intact, and this allowed it to supply the rebuilding.
Oh, all that rebuilding after World War II.
Yeah, and the new factories.
Yeah, because steel plants themselves are major consumers of steel.
Right.
Right.
But then he makes a prediction that's fascinating to look back on.
Okay.
He says, despite all the technological improvements in steel production, he suggested that within 10, 20 years, steel could become a declining industry.
Wow.
Due to competition from
new materials industry.
this new materials industry. And he specifically says that no other traditional material seemed that vulnerable.
This is fascinating. I mean, this is before the widespread adoption of, like, advanced composites, alloys.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder how accurate that prediction turned out to be.
Right.
But it just goes to show his ability to identify potential disruptions.
Even when they might have seemed far-fetched.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's consider the automobile.
Okay.
Drucker recognized that the automobile's role was huge in the rapid growth of places like Western Europe and Japan.
Yeah, it was massive.
But he also saw potential for it to continue to grow in other developed countries.
Except Russia.
At the time.
At the time, yeah.
With one notable exception, Russia.
Right.
He talks about the automobile representing mobility, freedom, its practical role in connecting nations, driving economic growth, creating demand.
Yeah, he even points to Brazil.
Okay.
That Brazil had a thriving automobile industry.
Right.
And that was an indicator that the country was at an economic takeoff point.
But then he also talks about this ambivalent part.
Ambivalent.
He observed this growing defensiveness around the automobile in developed countries.
Okay.
Outside of Russia.
Okay.
Because of problems like city congestion and air pollution.
Right, yeah.
What's so relevant today is that he foresaw that emphasis on alternative transportation.
Mass transportation.
And he noted the growing acceptance of banning internal combustion engines from city centers.
Wow.
And he cites New York's Commissioner of Air Pollution, who suggests this.
And the public was like, yeah, okay, this is an obvious next step.
It's incredible when you think about it. It really just shows you his ability to see the signs of major shifts in attitude and priorities.
It's absolutely prescient.
And then moving to an area where his foresight is really striking, information technology.
Oh, yeah.
He makes a bold statement back in 1968 about the coming impact
Of IT.
of IT.
Right.
And he said that cheap, reliable, fast, and universally available information would have as big of an impact as electricity.
I mean,
And think about this. Personal computers at this point were still largely science fiction.
largely science fiction.
I mean.
What a statement.
Yeah. And he goes on to predict that young people in the future would just rely on information systems as naturally as we used typewriters and telephones back then.
Like it was water or air.
Yeah.
Or electricity, for that matter.
And what's really insightful is that he draws this parallel with the anxiety surrounding the telephone when it first came out.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
People were afraid of the telephone.
People were afraid of the telephone.
Yeah.
But he suggests that people would eventually see the computer not as something to be afraid of, but as a tool for mind work.
For intellectual tasks.
You know, it's almost an understatement when you think about how information technology has become such a fundamental part of our lives.
Right.
Yeah. And he also talks about the potential for ocean exploration and development of new materials to have a huge impact on society as well.
Oh, yeah. And he uses a great analogy.
Yeah.
He compares it to the ancient Egyptians inventing the plow. At the time, the plow might have just seemed like a very simple tool, but ultimately it revolutionized agriculture and paved the way for the development of cities.
Right. Alongside the pyramids.
Right. And that's an important point.
Yeah.
Because he's saying, don't overlook these seemingly small developments because they can have massive impacts.
Right.
Right. And what's also forward-thinking is his vision for materials science. He says that plastics were just the very beginning,
Okay.
and that the future lay in our ability to design what he calls composite materials.
Specific properties.
With very specific properties, even talking about the microstructure of atoms, molecules, and hints at quantum mechanics.
Right.
To say that we would be able to engineer materials with combinations of properties that we'd never seen before.
Right.
Like a metal that's also elastic, or,
Yeah.
conductivity and resistance very carefully controlled.
Yeah.
Like in a transistor.
Right.
It's incredible.
And so he contrasts steel, which he describes as this multi-purpose material made as a compromise
For cheapness.
for the sake of cost effectiveness, with the potential for these new design materials to have far superior and very specific performance capabilities.
Yeah.
And this led him to suggest that steel would eventually need to become much cheaper just to compete.
Which shows you, again, how far ahead he was thinking.
Yeah.
He was thinking about how these fundamental advancements in our understanding of matter would change everything.
Absolutely.
New industries, reshaping old ones.
Yeah. And so then he moves on to talk about the evolution of cities.
Okay.
He talks about how that unesthetic, sprawling Großstadt.
Which basically just means like a big, chaotic urban center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Became organized.
Okay.
And he uses Haussmann's plan for Paris
Right.
as an example of this.
Yeah.
And he argues that this intentional organization, going beyond just aesthetics and traffic flow, actually had a deeper impact.
Right.
It released human energies
Oh.
and transformed cities like Vienna and Paris into major intellectual and artistic hubs.
Even amidst national political setbacks.
Right.
Wow.
And then he goes on to talk about the megalopolis.
Or megalopolis, right?
These massive interconnected urban regions
Right.
and the unique challenges they present,
Yeah.
particularly in creating community.
Community
Yeah.
and livability in tall buildings.
Livability.
Yeah.
He then offers this really interesting idea.
Okay.
He suggests that the meaningful technologies of the megalopolis might actually reduce the need for travel,
Oh.
and that information and ideas would move to people instead.
Okay.
And that would require entirely new industries.
That were unimaginable back in the 18th century.
Because when we got the subways and telephones and electric lights.
So he's saying something different is going to happen.
This concept of information replacing travel, it just feels incredibly relevant today.
Oh, yeah. Think about remote work.
Yeah.
Digital communication.
Absolutely. One of the most significant themes that runs through the whole book, which is so crucial for us to understand, is the rise of the knowledge-based economy.
Right.
He emphasizes that every new emerging industry at the time he was writing was fundamentally based on knowledge, not accumulated experience, which had been the case with technologies before the 1850s and even a lot of the modern industries of the 19th century, like automobiles and airplanes.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's really interesting. He points out that science and university-trained inventors actually played a relatively limited role in that whole heroic age of inventions before World War I.
With the exception of the chemical industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for a lot of those breakthroughs, it was practical tinkering and ingenuity.
Right.
And he contrasts that with the era that he was observing,
Yeah.
where success depended on the organization of large numbers of people to do what can be planned.
Right.
And he really highlights for us the growing importance of management skills
Yeah.
in harnessing and scaling new knowledge.
Yeah.
And he even predicts a return to entrepreneurship, but not like the lone inventor in the garage, but creating and leading organizations to bring these knowledge-based innovations to life, built upon management expertise.
He's got this great example of the steel production process,
Yes.
where he points out that people outside of the industry could see the economic advantage of a chemical flow process for making steel before the oxygen process was even developed.
Right. And he stresses that often those who aren't embedded in an existing industry can see the underlying vulnerabilities
And the opportunities.
much more clearly than the insiders.
Yeah.
And he also says that anticipating those major technological shifts isn't just scientific forecasting or guessing. It's true analysis.
And it's best done by entrepreneurs.
Looking for opportunities.
Right, to create new industries, new processes that address these big unmet needs or leverage newly available knowledge.
And so he lays out these questions that we should think about from an entrepreneurial perspective. What new industries or processes are emerging? What is the economic impact of recent developments in science or technology? What economic potential resides in all this new knowledge?
It's a big question.
That's a big question. What insights could lead to the creation of effective new technologies? And then he underscores the absolute necessity of a technological strategy.
Not just for business.
Not just for businesses, but also for nations.
In an age of rapid change.
And this involves making deliberate choices about whether to focus on, incremental improvements or radical breakthroughs or fundamental research.
Or exploiting gaps.
Exploiting gaps, yeah.
Right.
And he uses this image of a tree,
Oh, yeah.
the organizational tree,
Right.
where new ideas flow upwards from the roots, but vetoes flow downwards from the top.
Yeah, he's saying that if top management is focused on judgment,
Risk aversion.
they will inevitably veto all these promising new ideas as impractical.
And so he contends that genuine innovation and self-renewal can only happen when top management focuses on converting those half-baked ideas into action.
Right, so their job is to nurture those ideas, not shut them down.
And he also cautions us against aiming too low when it comes to innovation.
Oh, yeah.
He says often the effort to achieve those incremental improvements is similar to the effort for truly transformative ventures.
And that truly productive scientists and innovators are going to focus on those big, ambitious goals.
Right.
Because those are the ones that can create something really new.
Yeah. And it really highlights the importance of cultivating a mindset within organizations that encourages bold thinking and a willingness to embrace risk.
I love that, a willingness to embrace risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then he talks about craft unionism.
Okay.
And he points out how ingrained this model was in places like the U.S. and Great Britain.
Yeah.
Especially when compared to places like Japan and Germany and even the Soviet Union at the time.
Right.
And he explains that in Germany, after Hitler, there was a deliberate shift away from craft-based unions to industry-wide unions.
Right.
And this eliminated those frequent interjob disputes.
That were so common in the U.S. and the U.K.
And he also talks about what he calls problematic tax incentives.
Okay.
And argues for a shift away from structures that penalize the movement of capital.
More productive uses.
And instead encourage that flow.
Right. And then he touches on this idea that new technologies rarely originate in large, old companies.
And he gives some examples.
IBM, Xerox.
Yeah, and then he explores solutions to these monopolistic tendencies in the tax system.
Okay.
Like allowing businesses to offset capital gains taxes against their corporate income tax, or even substituting a VAT, a value-added tax.
If they have in Europe.
Right,
Yeah,
instead of a corporate profit tax, which he thought could actually enhance international competitiveness.
Right.
And he was really critical of the approach of governments directly subsidizing new technologies.
Right.
And he uses the UK Labour government as an example
Oh, yeah.
and argues that this kind of intervention just leads to wasted public funds and bad investments compared to letting capital flow based on market signals.
Right.
And so his argument is that the tax system should be designed to facilitate the efficient allocation of capital.
Instead of getting in the way.
Instead of getting in the way.
Yeah.
Now, turning to the global economic landscape.
Okay.
Drucker really makes a case for the rise of a world economy.
A truly interconnected one.
And he says that developed nations have to look beyond their own borders and use international indicators as a yardstick.
Right.
Not try to operate in isolation.
Or dominance.
Or dominance.
Yeah.
And so he highlights these smaller countries like the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, and even the phenomenal economic performance of Japan.
At the time.
At the time.
Right.
And he suggests that this outward-looking focus and their responsiveness to the international economy were keys to their success. And he emphasizes that for big economies like the U.S., the world economy acts as a bellwether.
A signal of future trends.
A signal of future trends.
Yeah.
And a way to highlight the adjustments we need to make.
To stay competitive.
To stay competitive.
And to keep growing.
And then he underscores the interconnectedness of global economic well-being.
Right.
And the need for growth.
In both developed and developing nations.
To address poverty and inequality.
Right.
And he says that there was no indication that we were going to hit the brakes on technological change and economic growth.
Right.
This was being driven by the aspirations of developing nations to improve their standard of living.
Right, which makes sense.
And other developed nations to catch up.
Absolutely.
And he makes this point that developed nations were approaching a stage where mass production industries would become less competitive.
Because of the rising investment in knowledge and education.
And so employing people in those roles
Right.
would be a misallocation of resources.
Right.
And then he introduces the idea that the cost structure of an economy is increasingly determined by the productivity of its knowledge.
The productivity of its knowledge, right.
Which requires developed economies to achieve high levels of knowledge productivity to stay competitive.
Yeah.
And so he posits this single world economy.
A single world economy in terms of expectations, responses to economic events, behaviors.
And he attributes this to this community of information created by movies, radio, television, communication satellites.
Right.
And he's basically describing the global village, which was also a big idea at the time by Marshall McLuhan.
Right.
And so he draws a parallel to the early American colonies.
Okay.
And how each colony has stronger ties with Europe than with its neighboring colonies.
Yeah.
And he suggests that the same dynamic is now happening on a global scale.
That national economies are becoming increasingly intertwined.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then he talks about this illusion of monetary sovereignty. He says, in an international economy, the idea of a nation having complete control over its currency is absurd.
Yeah.
He says every country has to adjust to its position.
Within that system.
Within that system.
Yeah.
He points to the experience of the British Labour government as a clear example.
Yeah.
Their frustration and resentment at being constrained.
By their international economic position.
Right. And so he says that we need some kind of limited and supervised international authority.
Wow.
Tasked with managing a global system.
A global monetary system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes decisions based on what's best for the world economy.
That's a big idea.
Yeah. And this really foreshadows
Yeah, it really does.
a lot of the discussions we have about global financial institutions today.
The challenges of global governance.
Yeah. And then he talks about the role of the multinational corporation as a force for integration and development.
The multinational corporation.
And he points out how these companies are operating with a global perspective,
Right.
not just their home markets.
Right. He gives examples like American companies setting up in Europe, Japan, India, or Swiss pharmaceutical companies investing in U.S. subsidiaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he talks about their multinational management structures and global approaches to scientific and technological innovation.
And he even offers this perspective from Europe.
Okay.
That American multinationals were actually key in making the European common market happen.
Because they were already thinking and planning in terms of a unified European market.
Yeah.
And so they were pushing the process forward.
Right. And he contrasts that with Latin America, where local businesses and governments were worried about protection.
Right.
Whereas multinationals were already planning for a common market.
Right.
And so he acknowledges the anxieties about American multinational power, but argues that, on balance, these corporations are the most effective instrument we have for development.
Surpassing even traditional aid programs.
Yeah. And so he advocates for strengthening them.
Through self-restraint and respect for local contexts and cultures.
Yeah. He really stresses their fragility, but also Their vital importance for building a developing, peaceful, and prosperous world, which he argues is in the interest of the U.S.
Which benefits from economic development in poorer nations.
Right, and then he goes on to talk about how industrial societies have largely overcome the conflicts of class warfare by making the poor wealthier.
But he also says that that's given way to a new kind of gap.
Yeah.
A gap between nations and cultures.
And he points out that unlike in the past, this gap is visible to everyone now.
Thanks to mass media.
Yeah.
And so it becomes an inequality within what is increasingly a global community.
Right, and he argues that the United States' ability to deal with the issues of poverty and lack of opportunity within its own Black population is really a critical example of this global problem.
Right, because he saw the situation of Black Americans as representing the challenges faced by the world's pre-industrial populations.
As they interact with industrial society.
And the growing inequality between white and colored people globally.
And he draws a link between failure to address these issues domestically and a growing global perception of an unbridgeable racial conflict.
Wow.
But he also suggests that success in overcoming these challenges in the U.S. could be a positive example for addressing the world's race problem.
Okay, so there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he goes on to talk about traditional approaches to development.
Yeah.
And he says that they're more demanding than we think.
Right.
They require intelligence more than money.
More than money, yeah.
And he explains that unlike the development in the 19th century, development can't be automatically financed by agriculture.
Or foreign capital.
Or in capital investment.
Right.
He highlights these limitations of foreign aid.
And government action.
Yeah, he says just pouring capital in from abroad isn't the answer.
And it can actually be counterproductive.
By creating liabilities, putting pressure on the balance of payments, leading to instability.
What he called disinvestment.
And so he stresses that foreign aid can only ever be a stimulant, not a solution.
The main engine of growth has to come from within.
Yeah, and that poorly conceived aid programs can stifle local energy.
Yeah, and he gives the example of U.S. surplus food aid.
Which can depress local markets.
Yeah.
And he states that the real test of whether aid is effective is whether it increases productivity.
Right.
He says development requires not just capital, but demand for that capital and the development and employment of talents with strong leadership.
Yeah.
And so he uses that example of Shibusawa in Japan who fostered entrepreneurship.
Right.
And then he points to these successful aid investments that were relatively small in forming management associations in Latin America or the Development Advisory Service in Pakistan.
Right.
And he reiterates his point that multinational corporations have.